Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Killian Chary. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm a researcher at Wageningen University, and my presentation of today will be related to a mix of conceptual and more technical aspects related to application of circular economy principles to aquaculture and the role of LCA to foster this transition. I'm sure I don't have to explain you why aquaculture is important. Patrick did it already, and you probably already know. And I don't have to explain you why it's important to make this sector as sustainable as it should be and as it can be. So my presentation will be more focused on how to make it sustainable and how to improve the environmental sustainability through circular economy concepts. But first, perhaps that I should explain what is circular economy. And there are many definitions that you can find in the literature, but in general, it's defined as an economic system that tries to decrease its environmental pressure by making a more efficient use of resources and reducing waste and emissions through different strategies like reuse, recycle, but many other concepts that you can see in the picture, like biomimicry, eco-efficiency, and so on. So this is a package of concepts. And this package of concepts has been recently adapted to food systems that rely on biomass, including food system. And in this adaptation, there were 5 principles that were presented. These 5 principles that you can see over there were, however, largely focused on terrestrial systems. Therefore, the examples that were presented in the paper were not really mentioning aquaculture. So for this reason, the first part of this presentation will be related to a work that is ongoing, and where with some colleagues we are trying to apply these 5 circularity principles to aquaculture. And in the second part of this talk, I will present you 3 LCA developments that I believe can support the implementation of these circularity principles. So let's look at these principles. The first principle focuses on the need to safeguard and regenerate ecosystems. So safeguarding ecosystems can mean managing aquaculture in the context of ecosystem carrying capacity. And as you know, aquaculture, like any activity, will necessarily generate local and global environmental stressors, but these stressors should not exceed what the ecosystems can assimilate or manage. The second part of this principle is about regenerating ecosystems. And regenerating ecosystems means enhancing nature benefits by promoting practices that have important ecosystem services. Think about bivalves or seaweeds, which can improve water quality, that are resilient. And you can also think about systems or practices that increase the resilience of the production systems, like having different species that are more resilient to change. The second circularity principle focuses on avoiding unnecessary environmental impacts by avoiding the production of non-essential products. And in this study, we defined essentiality based on essentiality of aquaculture products based on 2 main criteria. First, their nutrition and health benefits. And the second criteria is their contribution to food security. So looking at the first criteria, we can see that aquatic foods differ from terrestrial animal source food due to their fatty acid profile and micronutrient profiles. So on that base, some species group like bivalves, salmonids, or carp are particularly rich in these nutrients and can be seen as more essential than others. And if we look at the second criteria, which is contribution to food security, as already explained by Patrick a few minutes ago, aquaculture products that have the highest contribution to food security are those that target low-income consumers, and those that can be produced in large volumes. So you can think about carp, tilapia, milkfish, these kind of products. So along this second circularity principle, we should really focus on these products that have both nutrients, health benefits, and food security, a high contribution to food security. And we should avoid others aquaculture products that have less nutrient benefits and less contribution to food security. The second circularity principle also states that we should avoid food waste and losses, especially for most essential products. So although we don't really know how much is lost in aquaculture value chains, the figures that Patrick just shown us are for both fisheries and aquaculture. We don't really know what is the exact contribution of aquaculture in that, but we know the main drivers of aquaculture food of losses and waste in aquaculture value chain. And I've just shown some example on the figure. We know, as also presented by Patrick, that we can prevent some of these losses with short and longer term solutions, including the development of extension services, training, financial support for farmers, but also basic access to electricity, cold storage, etc., roads. Therefore, it requires also policies, appropriate policies. Then the third principle. The third principle focuses on using biomass and natural and limited resources for basic human needs before other uses. According to this priority hierarchy that you can see in the slide, we should use human edible biomass as food and not as feed. And this issue is called direct feed-food competition. And avoiding direct feed-food competition in aquaculture would imply changes in the feed formulation to avoid the use of maize, wheat, or other food competing ingredients, but it will also imply feeding aquatic animals with resources that we cannot or we do not want to eat, like food waste, microbial biomass, crop leftovers, insects, and so on. To be even more efficient, we should use primary resources such as arable lands or freshwater to produce human food and not feed. And we call this other issue indirect feed-food competition. And avoiding indirect feed-food competition from aquaculture would imply, for instance, considering alternative use and opportunity costs when determining suitable areas for aquaculture development. The fourth principle promotes the recycling of nutrients and carbon byproducts back into the bio-based system. When translating this principle to aquaculture, we can first think about the role of aquaculture systems or value chains as digesters. Digesters for food system leftovers. As mentioned before, fish or shrimp feeds, for example, can contain crop leftovers, food waste, or organisms produced from these leftovers, such as insects or yeast. But nutrients can also be recycled at farm scale in some production system. Think, for example, about integrated agri-aquaculture systems, where manure are used to fertilize ponds. So you are recycling nutrients at farm scale in this case. But the aquaculture systems also produce their own waste, their own set of waste and byproducts. So if we only look at processing byproducts, heads, shells, trimmings, etc., these streams can represent large volumes depending on the type of species. And as explained before, these streams should be used for food before other uses. So this would imply to find suitable upcycling opportunities, and there are really many, but also changing our consumer behavior. And a large part of what we consider as byproducts can be perceived as luxury or luxury food elsewhere. If you just think about some example, Japanese love salmon flaps grilled on the barbecue. We don't eat them in Europe. Norwegians consume cod chicks and tongues. And Czech people have popular soups made out of fish heads and gonads. So these are not waste. These are products that we can valorize. Then the last circularity principle advocates energy sobriety and the move towards renewable energy sources. That's very timely, right? Energy sobriety. And in aquaculture, some effective pathway to reduce energy include making an efficient use of energy-intensive inputs, like feed, fingerlings, of course. But it would also imply avoiding energy-intensive processes, such as air freight. It can also be clear, it's also clear that some species are less energy-intensive than others. For instance, bivalves or seaweed are much less energy-intensive than carnivorous species. So by culturing lower in the trophic level, we can save some energy. And it's also clear that some systems are less energy-intensive than others. Think about cage systems compared to RAS. And finally, we shouldn't produce everything everywhere. For instance, the culture of warm water species in RAS in Northern Europe is clearly not the best way to save energy. This other principle was about, this fifth principle was about also moving to renewables, and there are some options to do it. For instance, better using solar energy, adding solar panels on the farm, switching to systems that valorize solar energy through photosynthesis, like polyculture, integrated systems. And in the case of energy-intensive systems, there are opportunities to create eco-industrial symbiosis, for instance, by valorizing waste heat from the industry. So this was a brief summary of our reflections on the application of these circularity principles. And now that you have understood how circular economy can be used to improve resource efficiency and decrease impacts in aquaculture, let's see how LCA can support the implementation of this principle. Obviously, I'm not the first one trying to understand what are the links between LCA and circular economy. There are many papers that try to talk about that before. And what these papers say is that LCA is currently considered as the most suitable methodology to assess products, services, technologies in a CE perspective. Why? Because it allows to quantify emissions, losses, use of natural resources, but it's also useful to compare the environmental performances of different end-of-life or recycling options, and to identify potential trade-offs, including trade-off in terms of energy use. So indeed, LCA is useful to implement CE, but there are some key limitations that would justify further developments. The first limitation I want to talk about, is that most traditional LCA are expressing impact per gross unit of food produced. And depending on their feed conversion ratio, depending on the composition of the diet and other factors, and animals can be net consumers of proteins and other nutrients. So in LCA of animal source food, it would be logical to express environmental impacts per net unit of food produce, not per gross unit of food produce. And different methods can be explored to do so. For example, using alternative allocation methods, new impact categories, or alternative functional units. Then the second, another limitation of traditional LCA is that we can't really calculate impacts at a wider scale than the farm. And in some examples, circularity can be investigated at wider scale. For instance, when we try to investigate alternative land use, for instance, comparing the use of arable lands for feed or food culture, such assessments would require to enlarge boundaries of the studied system, not to study only the impact at farm scale. And for that, territorial LCA can be a pathway. And this type of LCA is currently under development and is attempting to assess all production and consumption activities located in the territory. Because I'm running out of time, I think that I will go to the conclusion. So LCA can help implementing circularity principles. Of course, it's just one tool. Other tools can be used and combined with LCA. And there are different methodological developments needed, but this would help to provide a more complete view of environmental performances of aquatic foods. So thank you. Here are my contact information and the references that I've used in this presentation.
So, thank you for your presentation. Are there any questions from the audience, or also from maybe we have one in the chat? They're asking, Killian, what do you think about conflict of LCA and sustainability? How to introduce more sustainable feedstuffs from waste or insects if they have a high footprint in LCA? And then they added LCA rather advocates for fish meal instead of sustainable feedstuffs.
I'm not sure I got exactly the question, but if I look at the conflict of LCA and sustainability, so LCA, as we said before, is just a way to measure some environmental impacts, not everything, and some feedstuff as waste or insects. The way we estimate the environmental impacts actually, and with the current technologies in LCA, result indeed in high environmental footprint right now. But as Patrick said before, if we upscale the technologies, then we might have a better environmental footprint in the future. And the interesting thing with these resources is that we can't eat them. So it's not really fair to compare something that we can eat and that have a high or medium environmental footprint and something that we can't eat. So because what would we do with these resources otherwise? So this is the most interesting thing to discuss, I think. The fact that we could do something with these resources or not, on the other hand.
So thank you. And we have one more from Max Troll. He wrote, who defines what is essential, what we should produce or not? Essential only out from a food security nutrition perspective, any culture, social consideration?
Good one, Max. Thanks for asking. We discussed that a bit before. I think that essentiality probably differs indeed between regions of the world, and we could use other criteria than the one we used. So food security, nutrition, we can think about the other roles of animals. And if we think about terrestrial animals, it's clear that they have many roles. They are an asset in certain culture. They have a role in livelihood and so on. So depending on the region, we should consider essentiality with other criteria. But if we only look at why we should produce food, I guess that we would agree that the most urgent criteria for food is to be healthy, so nutrition benefits, and that they contribute really to improve our efficiencies, so that contribute to food security.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again. I will now introduce